fazendo um filme, ou quando você está contando uma história, você não sabe o que tem ali dentro, beleza, mas você tem que ter pelo menos um payoff. Você sentir que, cara, valeu a pena. E eu lembro que nesse TED, o JJ ele fala assim, quando você entra no cinema, qual é o melhor momento? Quando você está ali, qual é o melhor momento de quando você vai ver o filme? The moment the lights go down is often the best part. Todo mundo fica... quando você ainda não sabe o que vai acontecer. And you're full of that amazing, that feeling of excited anticipation. Não, essa é a segunda melhor coisa. A melhor coisa... Mas a melhor coisa é quando de fato uma coisa maravilhosa acontece na frente dos seus olhos, seu JJ. Não adianta você prometer que uma coisa fantástica vai acontecer e ela não acontece. E esse é o problema desse cineasta e de alguns outros. Ela bota...
Leur toile ne ressemble à rien de connu. Et les curieux se pressent dans leurs ateliers ou sur rendez-vous chez Kahnweiler pour les découvrir. Tels les cyclistes qui s'élancent sur les routes du Tour de France pour la 6e année, Picasso et Braque se sont échappés du peloton. Il y a bien autour d'eux quelques jeunes peintres qui se lancent à leur poursuite, mais c'est sans compter sur l'esprit inventif de nos deux compères qui vont tout faire pour garder leur avance. Tout, jusqu'à casser leur propre système qu'ils viennent à peine d'inventer. Sans hésiter, Braque pulvérise à large coups de brosse les contours de sa femme à la mandoline. La géométrie vole en éclats. Les volumes semblent se disloquer. Et il faut beaucoup de sagacité pour reconnaître une femme dans les quelques mèches de cheveux ondulés en haut de la toile. Dans son guitariste, Picasso est encore plus radical que Braque. C'est comme s'il parsemait d'indices une composition abstraite. Ces quelques traits figurent-ils vraiment les cordes de l'instrument? Cette courbe, celle de la guitare? L'agencement géométrique un peu plus sombre peut-il se lire comme le corps du joueur? Cette ligne, ses épaules? Ce qu'accomplissent Picasso et Braque cet été-là est un bouleversement total. Le sujet, le motif central de la peinture depuis toujours, est en train de vaciller. À l'image de ces usines de Rio Tinto, où on ne perçoit plus que quelques détails, comme les cheminées ou l'arête des murs. La peinture menace de basculer vers l'abstraction pure. Pendant ce temps, Kahnweiler envoie des œuvres de ses poulains dans une exposition à Munich. Le cercle des collectionneurs s'étoffe. Sa stratégie à l'international commence à payer. Il a désormais les moyens de s'attacher ses artistes et d'avoir une exclusivité sur leur production. Il va même jusqu'à régler loyers et factures pour qu'ils se consacrent à leur création. Picasso a profité de cette manne financière pour troquer son vieil atelier miteux du bateau lavoir contre un appartement bourgeois du boulevard de Clichy. Le propriétaire de son immeuble, Théophile Delcassé, est un ministre influent. Pablo change définitivement de standing. Il accepte même de prendre une bonne pour la plus grande joie de Fernand. D'une nature plus lente et mesurée, Braque produit moins. Et comme sa discrétion naturelle ne le pousse pas non plus sur les devants de la scène comme Pablo, il vend moins cher. Sa vie est plus modeste. Le devant de la scène de l'art en cette année 1910, ce sont encore les vieux maîtres qui l'occupent. Tout particulièrement Monet, qui fait sensation avec ses premiers nymphéas et assoit définitivement l'impressionnisme dans le goût du public. Rodin, l'autre grande figure, signe commande sur commande et devient un véritable mythe encensé par la presse. Face aux deux patrons, les deux jeunes loups passent pour des barbares. Mais nos deux amis s'en fichent. Depuis 4 ans qu'ils se sont lancés dans l'aventure cubiste, la fièvre ne les a pas lâchés. Seuls les petits désagréments de l'époque, comme le service militaire pour Braque, arrivent à les séparer. Pablo se rattrape en posant dans l'uniforme de George, trop grand pour lui. Leur nouvelle manie est de s'appeler partner, un mot anglais qu'ils ont vu dans les romans de Nick Carter et Buffalo Bill. Toute la bande raffole de ces romans populaires et se repasse les numéros. Dans une de ses lettres, Apollinaire tient Picasso au courant des livraisons de Nick et de Buffalo. Il a dévoré les derniers et Braque n'est pas passé lui en apporter de nouveaux. Il est en manque. Les hauteurs de Montmartre ne sont pas les flancs escarpés des Rocky Mountains, mais les deux amis se sentent proches de l'esprit rebelle des hors-la-loi, qui n'hésitent pas à dégainer leurs pistolets pour répondre à leurs ennemis. Et lorsque Buffalo Bill présente son spectacle à l'hippodrome à 2 pas de Montmartre, la joie des deux copains est à son comble. Picasso, fasciné, lui consacre une toile. Chapeau à large bord, cheveux longs, moustache et foulard noué, c'est tout ce qu'il faut d'indice pour incarner le plus célèbre des chasseurs du bison. Cet art de l'indice qui leur permet de ne pas tomber dans l'abstraction, Picasso et Braque vont le systématiser en incluant tout ce qui participe de leur vie quotidienne. Dans Soda, Braque place sur la table les pipes qu'il adore fumer, une tasse à café et quelques lettres qui rappellent une vitrine de bistrot. Les deux amis ne sont pas des intellectuels. Ils veulent que leur art soit le reflet d'une vie simple. Un art réaliste, comme ils l'appellent. Un art populaire, en somme, à l'image de cette butte Montmartre qu'ils affectionnent tant, où se côtoient artistes et petits métiers.
Il y a l'art du peuple et l'art pour le peuple. Ce dernier a été inventé par les intellectuels.
Le message est clair, que ceux qui veulent leur coller une étiquette élitiste passent leur chemin. À l'été 1911, Picasso et Braque décident de louer une maison ensemble à Céret, non loin de Nîmes. Pablo profite de ce séjour pour faire découvrir la corrida à Georges. Braque est subjugué par la violence de ce spectacle nouveau que lui offre la reine. Il s'empare des attributs de la corrida, dans sa nature morte aux banderilles. Mais si la toile est un hommage au torero, elle est aussi un pied de nez à Pablo. Georges a devancé son ami en étant le premier à faire entrer les arènes dans l'aventure cubiste. Picasso lavera l'affront avec son aficionado l'année suivante. Il y reprend les mêmes motifs de banderie que Braque et les lettres Tor pour torero. Les messages codés des toiles des deux amis laissent la critique perplexe. Le journal satirique L'Assiette au beurre déclare:
La maison Kahnweiler propose à ses visiteurs la solution d'une série de rébus dont les auteurs sont messieurs Braque et Picasso.
Comme toujours, Apollinaire se démène pour prendre la défense de ses amis. Il tient Picasso informé par courrier.
La revue indépendante a paru avec un article de moi sur Georges Braque. J'ai mis de côté chez moi un exemplaire et je fais sur toi un long article pour le Mercure.
De quoi oublier les petites piques des journaux satiriques. Durant cette année capitale, le cubisme a gagné en notoriété. Paradoxalement, ce n'est pas à cause des deux jeunes maîtres, qui n'exposent toujours pas officiellement à Paris, mais de ceux qu'ils ont inspirés. Parmi ses suiveurs, ce sont les œuvres de Fernand Léger, Robert Delaunay, Albert Glaise et Jean Metzinger qui sont le plus remarqués dans les salons du printemps et de l'automne. Apollinaire, qui est désormais le critique d'art en chef de l'Intransigeant, qualifie ironiquement la toile de Delaunay de tremblement de terre. À propos de Metzinger, il lâche du bout des lèvres que
Ce petit garçon a droit qu'on fasse attention à lui.
en privé, son jugement est encore plus méprisant, si l'on en croit un journaliste qui le croise dans les allées du salon.
M.
Monsieur Apollinaire était accompagné du sympathique et pince sans rire Pablo Picasso. Tous deux se gossaient devant les toiles où sont groupés cubes, cônes, tubes.
Au début 1912, l'aventure des deux compères entre dans sa 5e année. Le tandem vedette n'a que faire des suiveurs et va briser un nouveau tabou, celui des matériaux. Le premier à se lancer, c'est Braque, avec son hommage à Jean-Sébastien Bach. Pour peindre le morceau de bois dans l'angle de sa toile, il utilise un peigne de peintre décorateur. Un détail qui peut paraître anecdotique, mais qui est comme une gifle à la tradition. Un vulgaire peintre en bâtiment pourrait désormais peindre des tableaux. Picasso va pousser un peu plus loin le sacrilège. Il colle directement sur un de ses tableaux un morceau de toile cirée, imprimé d'un motif de paille tressée. C'est le premier collage de l'histoire. Et pour finir de déconcerter son spectateur, il entoure sa toile d'une vulgaire corde à bateau en guise de cadre. Un geste totalement iconoclaste. Quelques mois plus tard, Braque surenchérit sur Picasso. Il achète dans un magasin de bricolage une bande de papier imprimé faux bois qu'il colle directement sur un dessin au fusain. Il y ajoute une étiquette de paquet de tabac. Un nouvel espace de liberté s'ouvre aux deux frères terribles. Il suffit à Picasso de coller 4 bouts de papier pour qu'apparaisse une guitare. Tout peut désormais devenir de l'art. Pablo et Georges se sentent plus que jamais une âme d'inventeur. Pablo, toujours taquin, affuble Georges du surnom de Wilbur, du nom d'un aviateur américain, Wilbur Wright, qui avec son frère défraie la chronique de l'aéronautique naissante. Tout comme les aviateurs, Braque et Picasso se rêvent en héros des temps modernes.
Si un avion ne suffisait pas pour décoller, ils en ajoutaient un autre et attachaient le tout ensemble avec des morceaux de ficelle et de bois. Tout à fait comme ce que nous faisions.
Quelques mois après avoir inventé le collage, les deux peintres se permettent un nouvel outrage. Ils ajoutent du sable à leur couleur. Rien ne semble pouvoir les arrêter dans leur course à la transgression. Picasso en remet une couche en utilisant de la peinture ripolin, une laque industrielle très brillante en vogue à l'époque. Leur attitude iconoclaste rebute jusqu'à leurs fidèles collectionneurs. Notre oublion s'en amuse, il y a belle lurette qu'ils ne respectent plus rien. Dans une lettre à Panmela, Picasso se moque de ceux qui se plaignent de son irrévérence.
Vous me dites que vous deux n'êtes pas mes derniers tableaux où il y a du ripolin et des drapeaux. Peut-être arriverons-nous à dégoûter tout le monde. Et nous n'avons pas tout dit.
Bon goût, mauvais goût, Picasso et Braque adorent en débattre. Pour eux, le bon goût c'est le Louvre et l'académisme qu'ils fuient. Le mauvais, les grands magasins du Fayel qui vendent aux provinciaux montés à la capitale des meubles tarabiscotés au goût douteux. Un tableau, pour être réussi, doit faire du Fayel. Durant l'année 1912, le rang des suiveurs grossit. Aux Metzinger, Glaise, Delaunay et Léger est venu s'ajouter Juan Gris. Le portrait hommage à Picasso qu'il expose donne l'occasion à Louis Vossel, la bête noire des cubistes, de taper encore une fois sur Pablo. Il lui attribue la paternité du mouvement et le traite de père ubucube, une façon de dire que ses toiles ne valent guère plus qu'une réclame pour les bouillons cubes. Apollinaire n'est désormais plus aussi moqueur avec les cubistes de salon. Il s'est rapproché de Delaunay, dont il encense la toile.
La ville de Paris marque l'avènement d'une conception d'art perdu et résume tout l'effort de la peinture moderne.
Mais le sentiment général est celui du virulent journaliste Gabriel Mouret, qui ne voit dans le cubisme que prétention et snobisme. cubisme échauffe à ce point les esprits que le scandale finit par atteindre les bancs de l'Assemblée nationale. Le socialiste Jules-Louis Breton s'élève publiquement contre les plaisanteries de mauvais goût des cubistes et voudrait leur interdire l'accès au salon. Marcel Samba, ami de Matisse, le renvoie dans les cordes. Quand on n'aime pas un tableau, il suffit de regarder ailleurs. Pas besoin d'appeler les gendarmes. Cubiste devient un adjectif à la mode dont on se sert pour tout ce qu'on ne comprend pas. Rigadin, l'un des premiers personnages comiques du cinéma encore balbutiant, se lance lui aussi dans l'aventure cubiste. Si Picasso et Braque méprisent les suiveurs, eux qui ont toujours un temps d'avance, ils n'apprécient pas qu'on leur fasse porter la paternité d'un mouvement qu'ils ne reconnaissent pas. À un journaliste qui lui demande ce qu'est le cubisme, Picasso assène un ironique.
Il n'y a pas de cubisme.
À la fin de l'année 1912, Picasso et Braque doivent, en plus des critiques habituelles, faire face à une avalanche de publications pro-cubistes. Le mouvement a à peine 6 ans, et chacun y va de sa théorie pour en forger la légende. Les peintres suiveurs Blaise et Metzinger sont les premiers à se lancer avec du cubisme. Rapidement suivi d'Apollinaire, qui a définitivement tourné sa veste et met Braque et Picasso dans le même panier que les cubistes du salon. Georges et Pablo le vivent comme une trahison. Du livre d'Apollinaire, Braque dit que loin d'éclairer les gens, il réussit à les égarer complètement. Picasso, de son côté, n'y voit que du blabla. Il l'écrit à Kahnweiler.
J'ai reçu le livre d'Apollinaire sur le cubisme. Je suis bien désolé de tous ces potins.
Kahnweiler, dans sa galerie de la Madeleine, n'apprécie pas plus ce qui se raconte. Mais tout ce bruit fait autour du cubisme favorise les affaires. Les collectionneurs étrangers se passionnent pour le mouvement. La stratégie internationale du marchand tourne à plein. Les toiles voyagent, se vendent et atteignent des sommes rondelettes. Au mois de juillet 1912, Kahnweiler a monté les enchères à 10 000 francs avec Tchokin pour une toile de Picasso, une somme considérable pour l'époque. Et au total, durant l'année, Pablo a vendu la quasi-intégralité de sa production à son marchand. Le jeune Espagnol vient d'avoir 31 ans. L'engouement grandissant de la scène internationale pour le cubisme va trouver un nouveau tremplin à New York au début de l'année 1913. Des collectionneurs et des artistes ont décidé de mettre en place la première foire d'art moderne américaine.
You're what? Haitian, Puerto Rican, or something?
Yeah, I was born here, but I'm always first generation Puerto Rican. Probably comes from here.
No. Do you feel that that's in your art?
Genetically?
Yeah, genetically or
I guess so.
culturally. I mean, from your.
Culturally.
I mean, for instance, Haiti is of course famous for its art.
Yeah, that's why I say genetically, 'cause I've never been there.
Yeah.
And, you know, and I grew up in, you know, pretty typical American background, you know.
In
Television mostly.
yeah. No Haitian primitives on your wall
At home?
at home?
Haitian primitives, I mean people?
No. I mean,
Basquiat would be an open antenna, having the TV on, having a book open, all at the same time, playing a record. He could deconstruct many influences and create something new that was unexpected.
Jean-Michel Basquiat is an artist who probes the boundaries of both Blackness and American art through his subjects, through his technique, and through his style.
Jean-Michel, c'est comme un médium, au sens extra-lucide. Il a une anticipation du chaos du monde. On ne peut pas dire d'un tableau de Basquiat, c'est joli, c'est mignon, c'est beau. Non, c'est bouleversant, c'est troublant et c'est révélateur.
In the 1980s, Basquiat very quickly gained fame. But today, Basquiat counts as one of the 10 biggest artists in all art histories. And of course, I'm sure you would like that.
He said, "Al, I'm gonna be a famous artist, and I'm gonna die young." And he certainly did both of those things. You don't forget that when somebody tells you that they're gonna die young.
Basquiat, un nom à fragmentation comme une grenade dans un cahier d'écolier. On sait déjà tout, presque tout sur l'enfant terrible, sur son intériorité de fauve adolescent, de foudre absolue qui repousse toujours plus loin les limites. Il a du feu dans les mains, le fils de roue, le flambeur d'étoiles carnivores, le peintre volcan, le pyromane au sang mêlé. Un charbon lui suffit pour tresser sa couronne de grand prince du cosmos.
Jean was extremely bright. He was like a walking encyclopedia, literally. And he would check you on facts. If you said something, we called ourselves the Washington Square Parkies. The way I feel about Washington Square Park and the way I know Jean felt about Washington Square Park, if you were to compare it to now, that would have been a social media place. Because that's where you went to meet people.
Jean-Michel Basquiat, who I knew as Jean at the time, we met in Washington Square Park the summer of 1976. We were both about 15 years old. We both found our way down to Washington Square Park. He had run away from home, and he was evidently staying sort of in Washington Square Park quite a bit. He was much more hardcore because he was away from home. I was going home at night. And I think he already knew he wanted to be an artist. So I think that's why he took himself there.
He joined me on my little set about 3 times. Around the 3rd time, I was like, where do you stay? Where do you live? And he told me, here. So I told him, come with me. And I brought him to my crib. The problem with that was, living with him, he literally started painting the house. Jean started painting the walls. And there were paintings all over the place. Jean said, I'm not really getting along with my dad right now. But that's just something, I guess, that motivated Jean to leave home. You know, his dad was not playing. Most dads don't play. Jean's dad did not play.
His father being of the upper echelons of Haitian society, he said, oh my God, my dad is Captain Normal. Which, from his perspective, made sense. His father was very straight, he was an accountant, he made money.
And I walk into this beautiful, beautiful place. And I was like, I thought you said you were homeless. And so he said, well, you know, I told you my dad threw me out, blah, 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 blah. I was looking at this place, I was like, I'm embarrassed.
And he told me that he was half Puerto Rican. I said, oh, no shit. And I said, Jean, is that French or something? He said, it's Haitian. So we struck it, we formed a bond just on the fact that he was half Puerto Rican.
His father was a big jazz fan. Gerard Basquiat was a huge fan of jazz music, so he heard a lot of jazz growing up.
His mother was taking him to Western art venues, MoMA, Brooklyn Museum.
He was always looking for some sort of acknowledgement or approval from a father figure and a mother figure.
Je pense qu'il souffrait trop pour en parler, c'était pudique avec lui. Et je pense qu'à un moment, il était fier de montrer à son père, papa, I made it, or I'm famous.
Jean-Michel probably in his home life was rather divorced from the Afrocentric aspects of Puerto Rican and Haitian culture.
I didn't see him identifying so much as in that strong, like, I'm Puerto Rican kind of thing, but he was definitely, he couldn't run away from his skin color. His ethnic identity more than anything was the fact that he was black.
We first met at City as School. There was no classroom. This was City as School. But each person had their own individual school. So John, of course, he was probably in the Museum of Art exclusively.
Yeah, we used to go to museum. We had a class with a well-known Sylvia Milgram, and she would talk about art. Like, I remember we were standing in front of Guernica. She was very enthusiastic and talking about, the war. But he was, interrupting and saying, "How do you know? What gives you the right to second guess what the artist was thinking or feeling or something?" Jean was naturally a brilliant sponge for information, but he was not a disciplined reader. He wouldn't take a book and read it cover to cover. He would skim it, and somehow absorb like the key and most important things.
John was one of the most intelligent people I ever met in my life, and he could read people and see through them within seconds, and we questioned everything at that time. And John questioned everything, and probably had a great reason to be there.
I was already an established graffiti artist by the time I did Samo. It was my idea to make it into a graffiti, Samo started as kind of a private joke, sort of, It was something that we used to say because we liked the way it sounded. Same old shit, same old. Around the same time, we had a school newspaper that we were working on. And Jean-Michel wrote a very funny story about a guy who had a kiosk. He sold religions. There was a special of the day, and it was Samo. It was a religion, a guilt-free religion where you basically did whatever you wanted to do. I had been a graffiti artist since 1971, and I thought it was a great idea to do in the tradition of Pray or Jesus Saves or one of those religious graffitis is to do like Samo. Samo is coming, Samo is here, Samo is an alternative to God, Samo is this, Samo is that. And between me and Jean, we started coming up with these phrases.
A pin drops like a pungent odor. Copyright Samo. Make soup, build a fort, set that on fire. Copyright Samo. These were like, wow, these enigmatic, poetic one-liners that just made you stop and think, this is not your typical graffiti, this is like a real poet.
Already, he was a hero, even though almost nobody knew who he was. How compelling this graffiti haiku was.
We changed the game in a sense. We put something new into it.
So people thought actually it was a conceptual artist going around and taking the street, but not therefore the graffiti community never accepted Basquiat as a graffiti artist.
He was not part of graffiti culture. He was an artist, of course, he was born to be an artist, but he was never writing on the walls. That didn't happen until I introduced him to it.
From this conceptual side, he also integrated this idea of the words, of the then symbols, signs in his work.
It is the Canal Zone, and it's happening here and now. If you're lost, you can find yourself right here, right now in the Canal Zone. On April 29th, 1979, we organized the first Canal Zone party. We did it for the Fabulous Five, which was a graffiti crew, and we did it to invite the downtown art scene. It was in essence part of what would become hip-hop. And that Canal Zone party was the first time that hip-hop artists and the downtown fine artist scene, hipsters, punks, new wavers, would rub shoulders together. So, as we're setting up, this young, handsome, charismatic black man, 19 years old, shows up and says, I want to be part of this too. And we were like, sure, okay. So we put up a big piece of photo paper and gave him a can of red spray paint, and he starts to paint which of the following symbols are omnipresent. A, Lee Harvey Oswald. B, General Malin. C, the Coca-Cola logo. D, Samo copyright. And instantly, we were like, oh my God, this is Samo.
Samo! S-A-M-O. Come on, you see that on the walls everywhere, especially on the building. This general right here is Samo.
He was so special. He was so many years, decades ahead of all of us in the way that he approached his voice, in the way that he approached his public image, in the way that he approached his name, his brand. So of course, when he sees me interviewing people, he's has to be interviewed as well, because he thinks maybe this will make history, and it did.
Jean saw its potential to use it as a springboard. He's like, oh, I'm Samo, I'm Samo.
Tonight, we're lucky enough to have with us probably the most language-oriented of all graffiti artists in New York, Samo, and his associate. Samo, sorry. Sorry, Mr. Samo.
To me, it was like, okay, that it's over now, because we got outed, so now they know who it is. There's no fun in doing that. He really wanted to become famous. He was very obsessed. He was doing more and more art.
At our Canal Zone party, at that moment, right away, he said, let's start a band together. And I was like, yeah, sure. And we started Gray that night. If you were a real musician, we did not want you in Gray, because you brought all this luggage and all this knowledge that would weigh us down. Jean-Michel and I, we established Gray in that we're not going to try at all. We are going to, with confidence and with arrogance, make not music, but soundscapes and atmosphere, and do things like I would pull masking tape off of a drum head, and then pull the tape off and make sound. And Jean would take a guitar and loosen all the strings and take a metal file and run the file along the strings of the guitar. And we would look for ways to make sounds that you'd never heard before. Our last gig at the Bud Club, I'm looking out at the audience, and there's a sea of Edwin Munch faces, just like, and this kid, this young teenage kid, comes running backstage. He said, do you realize your whole set took only 12 minutes? And Jean, real cool, smoking a joint, said, brevity's the point. Brevity's the point.
I was doing a lot of music videos for local groups, including Madonna, by the way. Saturday, midday, my doorbell rang. Two guys who I didn't know. Some person I knew met them and said they should make a video with me. And I said, I have no idea what's going on, but let's do something. Jean had just bought a recording Walkman and went around the city recording sounds of the city. During the performance, he played back some of them into the microphone. It was very cool. This is the scene was like in the early 80s in New York City. If you were a painter, you probably worked with a musician or a dancer or a sculptor or a singer.
Our ambition was to impress our fellow downtown artists, hipsters. That's who we wanted to impress.
More or less it was a small scene, but in our historic view on it, it expands to one of the most important moments, one of these in art history.
And we knew that we were the new Belle Epoque. We knew that we were Paris in the 20s. In essence, we felt it.
It was a kind of artist paradise. There wasn't much money around, but it didn't cost much money to live. Everybody was there within an area of about 20 blocks. It wasn't just the young artists, because the senior artists were hanging out too. You would see Andy Warhol on the street corner giving out copies of Interview.
Andy Warhol, in many ways, bridging the 60s and into the 70s, he was the conductor. He was our Pied Piper. He played his flute, and we danced to New York. The tune of his flute said, "You can do anything you want. You can be anyone you want. Come with me, children, to the land of magic. Come to me. Come with me to New York City, where you can dance, do drugs, and have sex, and make films, and make music, and be actors, and be sculptors, and be painters, and be writers, and be graffiti artists, and DJs, all at the same time. And all you have to do, the only price you have to pay, is you have to be a New Yorker." After Gray had disbanded, and we disbanded because Jean-Michel Basquiat was starting to get a name in the art world as a painter. And then the PS1 show happens that had been curated by Diego Cortez, and Jean-Michel blows up as a painter.
A great departed friend, Diego Cortez, took me to Jean-Michel's apartment, or took me to his girlfriend's apartment, where I met Jean-Michel, and we had our first real conversation about art. What really struck me was the refrigerator. Jean-Michel, on the door of the refrigerator, had created this phenomenal drawing. And I remember telling Andy Warhol about it, and Andy Warhol eventually bought the refrigerator. Strewn all over the floor were these small drawings on typing paper, not even art paper. And there must have been 50 of them. And I got on my hands and knees with Jean-Michel and looked through, and I picked out 5 of them that I thought were particularly strong. And they were $50 each. It may have been the first sale of Jean-Michel's.
Music is literally all around with Basquiat. I mean, first of all, you know, some of his works are sound poems. When you read aloud the words, it's suddenly getting a rap. So in other works, he would represent notes. He would represent parts of Red Cross from Charlie Parker.
Jazz was something that he played a lot while he worked, while he painted. But he loved all kinds of music. All kinds of music. He loved classical, he loved avant-garde, he loved, you know, Stockhausen and John Cage and rock and roll and the Stones and the Beatles and James Brown. And
he didn't like R&B music. He didn't like soul music. He liked James Taylor. He liked Cat Stevens. He loved Joni Mitchell.
He liked the Ramones and Elvis Costello and whatever was the Talking Heads, television, all the downtown bands and the...
He would sing the Elton John stuff, the loud stuff. Someone save, someone save, someone save. I was like, paint, I'll sing, you paint.
So there's so many music references, and when you start discussing it, you will not end, because it's all there. So it is about picturing sound, and it is about the jazz musicians. It speaks about the life of Charlie Parker. It speaks about the death of his daughter Cree. It speaks about King Zulu, Louis Armstrong. Even in the composition method, music is there.
Basquiat was especially concerned with allowing important musicians in jazz, because it's such a black-dominated field, representing them in text and in figures in his work.
These jazz musicians were incredibly celebrated and hailed as some of the greatest artists of their time. But as soon as they stepped off stage and put their trumpets and saxophones down, they were once again reduced to the color of their skin. They literally had to enter through the back entrances to club that profited off of their names. In a similar fashion, Basquiat was always very conscious about his place as a young black man in a predominantly white art world.
Le nombre d'artistes noirs de couleur ou hispaniques dans les grands musées, c'était 1%, 8%.
Basquiat was painting during the Reagan years, so we were in a very conservative time of our government. It was a racist city. The racial politics in New York were very challenging, and there was a really dreadful, tragic murder of a young man named Michael Stewart, a young black man at the hands of the police.
Michael Stewart was a friend of both of ours. And it also, it's a guy who could have been us. He wore short dreadlocks, kind of a middle-class kid of African ancestry from New York City, arts-oriented, kind of quiet, a little bit shy.
Lui, il fait un petit grave avec son, même pas la bombe, le magic marker, et à ce moment-là, il a des flics qui lui tombent dessus, et il le fouille et il trouve un petit peu d'herbe. Et est-ce qu'il a eu peur et qu'il a essayé de résister? Est-ce qu'il a, je pense que c'est ce qu'ils ont essayé de dire, toujours est-il qu'ils ont fait exactement la même chose que beaucoup d'autres. Ils l'ont mis en choc. Et donc en fait, il est mort étranglé. On apprend que ses yeux ont été enlevés pour être remplacés par d'autres yeux. Et ça, c'est terrible. Pourquoi? Parce que quand tu es étranglé, c'est dans les yeux que tu vois. Et donc, quand il est arrivé ce grand malheur, ça a fait un choc, wave, tremblement de terre, disons, dans ma communauté.
I think we're talking about more than police brutality. I think we're talking about more than a close friend that everybody's, is killed senselessly. It would be foolish to think that people would ever get over their prejudices about race, the color of person's skin.
Quand tu regardes la peinture d'Effacement que Jean-Michel a fait juste après cet événement, tu vois l'importance des personnages que sont les policiers, avec le bâton, le symbole. Tu vois pas un portrait exact de Michael, tu vois une silhouette qui pourrait être Basquiat. Et si tu remarques, il n'y a pas la couronne. Il y a une colère qui tourne, un peu comme un 8 à l'infini qui dirait quel va être le futur pour nous. Est-ce que les choses vont changer?
I remember we were all kind of freaked out about it, but John and me, we had a conversation, and at that point he looked at me and he says, "Man, that could have been me." And growing up within the context of our world, we understood quite viscerally. We understood the problem that existed.
At that time, I think the police were super corrupt and there were changes happening. You had, obviously you had Michael Stewart, but then you had the continuation of the chokehold and stuff that was happening in Queens. You know, the way you moved in space as a black person or a person of color was affected.
The response that I think a repeater, three-time repeater should get would be 5 days in jail. Now, obviously, as a murderer, if you believe in the death penalty as I do, you want to have the option of executing a murderer. You wouldn't do that to a graffiti writer.
Is there any anger in it?
Of course there is. Yeah, of course there is.
Tell me what about the anger in it? What do you mean?
There's part of being black, part of being a person of African ancestry that makes you angry all the time. That's something he would know, and pretty much any person of color or of African ancestry in the West knows.
He said my work is about 80-90% about anger. There was also, of course, fear after the death of Michael Stewart. All this is part of his art. His works are politics.
Il y a un rôle politique d'anticipation.
I think that the work of Jean-Michel Basquiat is just as relevant, if not more relevant today than it was when it was originally painted. I think what interests me is the ways in which the work of Basquiat really predated a lot of our understanding about what black art could be. But because Basquiat maybe came a bit too early, we didn't yet have the vocabulary to understand what he was doing, the complications that he was introducing into both the history of painting and into the history of blackness.
He was a Twombly, he was a Jasper Johns, he was a Rauschenberg, he was a Picasso with his own voice and a black voice. I got a call in the morning from my editor at the Times, and she assigned me to do a story on graffiti artists, and she gave me a list: Basquiat, David Sally, Keith Haring, and their gallerists. The Times decided very fast that he would be the cover of the issue. It was a New York Times cover of a black kid. His first photograph that was a portrait, not a reportage picture of him.
At the time, the New York Times magazine was very big. They brought to me the idea of writing about Jean-Michel Basquiat because they wanted to have an artist who would be a case study of what was happening in the art world in a moment where it was very feverishly heating up. His being black was significant in the art world at that time because there were so few black artists of his generation. I mean, I'm pressed to think of any who gained that level of fame. When I began the story, I had no idea, nor did anyone else, that it would end up being a cover story. But it had an enormous impact, both because of the topic, but also I have to give credit to the photographer. I think it was a very powerful image taken by Lizzie Himmel.
When I first walked into the studio, his studio manager was there, who was a young sort of a Rastafarian guy, who was really straight and very nice, but said, Jean-Michel is upstairs and he's, asleep. There was a girl in bed with him, and when I went to the closet, I knew he could look like an Rastafarian. I knew that he could look like a dreadlock guy. But I also knew that he owned very expensive suits and enjoyed that. There was something important to me about the status of a suit, the elevation of putting an artist in a suit, even though I left off the shoes. I needed to be able to really control his body shape because he was flopping around, so I put down a chair so that he could put up his foot so that it would look elevated. There was a conscious effort to make him looking at him looking at the audience. What he presented as portraits for his creatures or his beings were present to him. Instead of him painting them live, they were his audience as he was being photographed.
I did not write the headline on the front page, which was New Art, New Money, but I heard that Jean-Michel did not like that. I felt that Jean-Michel was a bit reluctant to be interviewed, maybe by such a mainstream publication. I think Andy Warhol, who he had become friends with, told him it would be a very good thing. He wasn't really used to a big press interview. He was young, and I did find him shy. I did find it, I needed to drop him out a bit.
He must have been aware that we were coming, and he chose to sort of blow us off.
I don't know if the stereotype of an artist in the studio, you know, while they're working is really true. I mean, there's always photographers coming to the studio and stuff like this. A lot more of it day-to-day life is sort of documented and kind of put out there, you know what I mean? Go to a restaurant and they write about it. And the post on page 6.
If you look at all of his elements, there's so much intellect within language of what he writes on things versus his childlike drawings, that the duality of those two things coming together in one image is what makes him, to me, such a genius. When I walked into the studio and I saw the paintings separated out on a wall, I was in love.
I never met him again. Never.
He wanted to be famous and to be iconic. He became a legendary icon.
It was 85 when he established a strong friendship with Warhol. The idea that Jean needed Warhol to become famous is not true.
Lorsqu'Andy Warhol a parrainé le travail de Jean-Michel, c'était aussi parce qu'il a compris qu'il y avait un mouvement.
And it was a very interesting collaboration because it is very much in the sense of remix in this understanding today. It's a remix of the motifs of Warhol and the symbol signs and figures of Basquiat in a very dynamic, in a very convincing way.
Jean-Michel wanted to be the most famous artist in the world, and Andy was the most famous artist in the world, so that was the attraction.
Sure is.
I think that Jean-Michel kind of maybe was always sort of looking for a father a bit.
In the fall of 1985, he did a show at the Jean-Michel Gallery. Everything what Warhol would do at that time would be criticized by the media. Of course, that was criticized as well. And some of the words in the media were deeply hurting for Basquiat. To be called the mascot of Warhol is, of course, devastating, and they wouldn't show the collabs during their lifetimes again. They wouldn't continue working together after that.
In one of his collaborative paintings with Andy Warhol, the word hybrid is featured. And Jean had a lot of hybrid in his life, being black and white society, being able to understand Spanish, but feeling that not necessarily akin to the Puerto Rican community. Same with being Haitian. He was kind of, I would assume, quite an outsider to the Haitian community, but everybody attributes being Haitian onto him. All those things gave him an outsider, insider perspective that allowed him to, I think, penetrate deeper into some of those things.
I think that Jean-Michel Basquiat's work is so unique and so impactful because he reveals to us the failure of binary ways of thinking about American art.
I think what I regret in retrospect in interviewing him was not pressing him more deeply about his own background, his family, and more deeply about his art and where he wanted it to go. I saw on his coffee table a very important book by Robert Ferris Thompson called The Flash of the Spirit, about African and African American art. And about the time that I did interview him, he was meeting Robert Ferris Thompson.
Thompson's work was really groundbreaking in its identification of the visual and cultural influence of Africa as it crossed the Atlantic during the slave trade and ended up in the Americas. So we see the presence of Africa, both its religious systems, its histories, its politics, all materialized in the work of Jean-Michel Basquiat. With the boxers in particular, we see a history of violence, that it damages, right, these athletes' bodies, that they are in part sacrificing themselves for the entertainment and for the pleasure of mostly white mainstream audiences. We also see a similar pose in some of Basquiat's depictions of slaves, where we see slaves in shackles, right, with their arms raised, labeled not for sale. We can't ignore that there's a visual analogy being made between these boxers and their sacrifice and the exploitations of Africans and the Americas under the rubric of slavery.
The victory poses, the warriors marked with weapons, with the crown of thorn, the crown. This speaks about self-empowerment of his figures and of course also himself.
I think that in some ways, Jean-Michel Basquiat was constantly concerned with his own position within the art world as a successful Black man. And I think that there were potentially some expressions of his own fear of potentially having the same fate as some of these musicians and athletes that he commemorated in his paintings.
There's a creation of African culture that was lost. There's an aspiration to find within yourself that connection to Africa and then present it creatively. I think that Jean was able to tap into that and find it.
He once said in an interview that although he had never been to Africa, he knew Africa, that there was sort of a cultural memory of Africa that he found within himself.
He began researching and getting deeper into the question of Black Atlantic, the question of slavery, and exploring the reason and the sources for the racism and the suppression of African Americans and people of color in the US. And by this, going into history, of course, he drew clear lines from past to his present, where he couldn't hail a cab himself, to the future.
Hip-hop culture is extremely influenced by Basquiat. There is a very important rapper in hip-hop named Grandmaster Caz. He said, hip-hop didn't invent anything. Hip-hop reinvented everything. And in this way, Jean-Michel Basquiat is a lot like these hip-hop artists.
Don't stop the rock. Keep talking to the ladies on.
Someone who becomes very important to him and becomes a very good friend to him is Ramel Z. He decided that he wanted to try his hand in a sort of hip-hop musical experiment, and that became beatbop.
Get funky in space.
John was instrumental in producing and sculpting the sound of that record. It was surprisingly good. It was a lot better than we thought it would be. It's a really great song, and it's lasted very well.
Basquiat attracts the young and youngest generation in a way that hardly any other artist or the living artist does. Certainly because he was sampling, scratching, the information surrounding him, all the source material surrounding him in a copy-paste way we work today.
His ability to cut things up like a cut-up artist, like William Burroughs. In essence, Basquiat was so inspired by William Burroughs.
And when you look at his work, he has a work. He changes one single letter, and it makes a huge change, or replaces teeth in the face with the word teeth. So first of all, teeth in writing has a very special structure. So it actually reminds us a word of teeth themselves. So it is a double thing. It's not just replacing the teeth with the word, and you intellectually, if you understand the language, can read it. But even if you cannot read the language, teeth still resembles the structure of teeth. And that's the genius of Basquiat, how he worked with these ideas and concepts.
Because of the strength of his personality and the history of his insane level of celebrity, Basquiat's work is often overlooked critically. I think that he was an artist that throughout his lifetime grew increasingly frustrated with interviewers and critics who refused to take him seriously. We have interviews where he antagonizes, right, his interviewers, asking them, are these the same questions that you would ask of Robert Rauschenberg?
On oublie trop souvent de dire que les critiques, à ce moment-là, commençaient à dire qu'est-ce qu'il y a après?
Becoming famous, you will become a cliche. People become tired of you, and they'll start coming at you for all the wrong reasons. You know, after the little party, after they put you on that little pedestal, don't worry. At some point, they're gonna start throwing rocks, and then they're gonna start throwing stones, and they're gonna start throwing boulders. You just better be ready for it.
The pressure was on to produce, and he was, you know, as many young artists or actors, James Dean or, you know, anybody else, if you become too successful too young, you don't know how to handle it. And he was in that moment of not being able to handle it.
The last time I saw Jean was when he dropped off the two Walla from Walla, the Senor Stanayo painting that I sold. I don't regret the fact that it's insured for $22 million now, and I sold it for $3,500. I don't. That's not what I regret is that I didn't appreciate that he had made it specifically for me, which is much more important than any sum of money, you know. And I was in a bad state. I used drugs for many years too.
Towards the end of Jean-Michel Basquiat's life, I feel that he lost two very important rudders, Andy Warhol and Chenge Calfero.
Chenge comes from Barbados and ends up as Jean-Michel Basquiat's studio assistant sometime in early 1983. And in this role, he lives with Basquiat in his studio loft. Chenge may have introduced Jean-Michel Basquiat by way of his politics and religious affiliations to Africa.
Jean-Michel eventually locked Chenge out of the residence at Great Drum Street. I think that left Jean all by himself, rudderless and adrift out in a fairly dangerous world.
It's like people would think that once I have a lot of money, I'm going to be so happy, or once I get whatever, then I'm going to be happy. It just sort of, it didn't bring him closer to connecting with people or connecting with stuff. It made him feel more frightened and more foreign and different. And he felt really alone. He said he felt like everybody wanted something from him. People were going through the garbage and taking his artwork out of the garbage and selling it. He didn't know who his real friends were. I know that he got sadder as he became more famous. He became sadder and felt more alone.
Volcan s'abreuvant de son magma, Jean-Michel rêve de plonger dans ses fondements
pour remonter le fil de ses origines. L'Afrique le hante.
In 1986, he tells his dealer Bruno Bischofberger that he'd like to go, and Bruno's connection to the Swiss ambassador actually lands Jean-Michel an exhibition in the Ivory Coast. That ambassador tells him something that he already knows, that African art is about more than formalism, that it's about performing a function to repel ghosts. This is a phrase that we see appear over and over in works of Jean-Michel Basquiat. He begins to imbue his own paintings and drawings and objects with that same functional purpose, right? That same sort of spiritual purpose.
There's a photo of him maybe in a canoe, and he's got that smile, that that giant smile. He did, to me, that made me think he was very content in Africa, home.
But in other ways, we might imagine that Jean-Michel's experience may have been similar to that of other Black Americans who traveled to the African continent, a feeling of both simultaneously a homecoming, but also an alienation. As someone who is still distinctly raised in the United States as the child of immigrants.
Jean-Michel, que j'ai connu en 88, n'était pas le même. Il y avait l'annonce d'une transition dans son travail.
In winter of 1988, Jean-Michel Basquiat goes to Paris for an exhibition at a local gallery. And it's there that he encounters the painter Ouattara Watts. And Watts is actually from the same town in the Ivory Coast that Basquiat had visited and exhibited in 2 years earlier. It's at Watts' invitation that Basquiat considers a trip to Africa later after the summer in 1988.
Jean-Michel charge son nouvel ami d'aller préparer le terrain pour un nouveau voyage en Côte d'Ivoire. Il souhaite obtenir l'aide des ségouts pour une pratique rituelle, afin d'être totalement exorcisé de tout ce qui le plombe et le tracasse. Ouattara est à Abidjan, Basquiat a son ticket en poche. Le 12 août 1988, le corps de Jean-Michel est retrouvé sans vie à New York, suite à une surdose de cocaïne et d'héroïne. La veille du voyage.
This second trip to Africa, which was planned for a month or more, was for Basquiat to take part in a ritual cleansing that would cure him of his drug addiction.
That's how he was going to approach the rehab, by going to Africa. That's how he was going to do it. He was going to do it in a tribal way. How to say it? That's deep, man.
He somehow knew that his life would burn bright and short and quick, like a meteorite across the sky. He knew that he had so much to do in so little time. And that's why he painted every day. That's why he made drawings every day. He knew. Brevity's the point.
Joan Miró, ¿se puede decir en pintura ya hasta Joan Miró y después de Joan Miró? Hombre, creo que sí. Moi, je reviens avec du grand temps, mais quand tu n'as pas le lien, ça passe toujours.
Women grew the birds of 1950, ladies and gentlemen. Where's your this? 3 million, 3,200,000, 5 million pounds, 8,500,000 I have, 38 I have, and selling to the telephone here. You're both out. Yours is running at 13,800,000.
In Joan Miro's studio in Panmela, New York, time has stood still. It still houses the artist's possessions and his unfinished canvases. It's a monumental and protean collection. Nearly 2,000 paintings, drawings, carpets, ceramics, and sculptures of all dimensions. Today, it's the artist's grandson, Joan Miro, who runs this impressive estate on his own. The responsibility weighs heavily sometimes.
Joan Miró era un tresor de dia, però un monstre de nit. Durant les estàncies a l'estudi o a casa nostra era una persona luminosa, sensible, carismàtica, però també hi havia una part fosca, una part oscura, una part atormentada, que feia que la relació diària amb ell fos molt més conflictiva i de fet a vegades no més.
Puignet devotes his life to studying his grandfather's work. He also extols Miro's most unorthodox and transgressive traits.
La personalitat de grans genis com el Joan Miró va marcar moltes generacions i la seva memòria ha de seguir viva. La meva gran obsessió és que aquest foc, aquesta flama, mai s'apagui.
Miro is often seen as a consensual artist, with his luminous, almost childlike style. But behind his introverted expression lies another Miro, a tortured nihilist, eminently subversive.
Per mi el Miró era un rebel, amb tota naturalitat. Ell era la seva actitud. La prova és que abans de néixer ja va ser un rebel, perquè la mare creia que estava esperant una nena.
Joan Miró was born in Barcelona in 1893 into a shopkeeper's family. He was drawn to painting from a very young age. Barcelona was buzzing economically and artistically, and was enthralled to the great modernist architect Gaudi. He extolled the importance of artisanal work, and with his deep love of nature, was a reference for a whole generation of Catalan artists. As a young man, Miró was nourished by his influence. He took evening classes at the Academy of Fine Arts, but his father did not want him to become an artist, and made him do business studies. Miró became an accountant in a large company, but after 3 months, he had a nervous breakdown.
Eso fue terrible para mí, una gran depresión. Yo me enfermé. Cuando mis padres vieron que yo estaba en el estado ese físico, vieron con ese dicho, no hay nada que hacer, que pintar pues allá.
His parents sent him to the family's country home at Montreuil-del-Camp to recover. It was here, among the orange groves, that Miró decided to devote his life to painting.
I want to paint all the time. When I'm not painting, I worry, I get depressed. I have dark thoughts, and I do not know what to do.
Montreuil was a turning point for the young Miró.
Montreuil touched me with all its light and life. That is where my feet were anchored in the earth.
1922, the artist paid homage to the family home with one of his most famous paintings, La Masia, the farm.
I wanted to put everything I loved about the countryside in this painting, from a huge tree to a tiny snail. For 9 months, I worked on the farm for 7 or 8 hours a day. I wiped out many versions, and I began to get rid of outside influence.
This painting marked the end of the artist's realist period, but it also contains several elements that can be found in later works, like ladders and birds. Miro was deeply attached to his homeland, but needed to widen his intellectual horizons. He went to live in Paris, the place for every kind of cultural revolution. When he arrived in Paris, Miro linked up with the painter he admired the most in the world, his fellow countryman, Pablo Picasso.
La relació amb el Picasso, evidentment, era molt forta, de gran amistat, perquè el Picasso era 10 anys més gran que el Miró i sempre el va protegir. Des que va arribar a París al 1920, el Picasso li va enviar el Carbaire, li va enviar poetes, Miró Picasso era el pare, que el va sempre acollir a París i li va donar els millors consells per aconseguir aprofundir amb el seu camí artístic.
Picasso introduced him to the avant-garde circles, and through his friend, Max Ernst, Miro met Louis Aragon and André Breton, who had just written the manifesto of Surrealism. Surrealism encouraged automatic writing, which it thought emanated from the unconscious mind and dreams. This inspired Miro to create a new language, far from the realism of his earlier works. In 1925, he painted Harlequin's Carnival, perhaps the most surrealist of all his works.
Ça, c'est une toile très importante pour moi, non seulement au point de vue toile peinture, mais au point de vue humain. Parce qu'à cette époque-là, nous étions grands déterminés, nous étions pas pauvres, misérables. Toutes ces choses que vous voyez là, c'était des hallucinations qui étaient provoquées par un fait naturel, comme on dit par là.
There are elements in this painting that will come back later. The ladder to escape, but also to climb higher. The animals, especially insects, which had always interested me a lot. The black circle on the right represents the world, for at that time, I had only one thing in mind, to conquer the world.
Fer una cosa que li sortís d'una manera autèntica, no dintre seu, i crear un llenguatge i una personalitat.
À ce moment-là, j'ai commencé à fréquenter les poètes, alors j'ai senti que j'avais des besoins de dépasser la peinture, de rapprocher la poésie. J'ai fréquenté beaucoup plus de poètes que les peintres. Et c'était la poésie qui m'intéressait par-dessus tout. Après avoir suivi une discipline d'artiste très sévère.
The poets Paul Éluard, Robert Desnos, and Armand Salacrou inspired Miro to paint his first painting poems.
The body of my dark-haired woman, because I love her, like my pussycat dressed in Salabri, like hail, it's all the same. This is the color of my dreams. A bird pursues the bee and lowers it. What matters is to bear one soul. Painting and poetry is like making love. It's an exchange of blood, the total embrace, no holding back.
Miro moved into an artist community, Les Fusains, in the heart of Montmartre, where several surrealists already lived.
Ici, toi qui as vécu ici, tes souvenirs, ils sont là, ils sont vivants, ils sont très vivants comme ils étaient là. Oui, pas exactement pareil. Ici, il y a la serre, pour le diable, les choses ont bougé, ça n'a pas du tout bougé.
Miro became more and more radical and declared that he wanted to assassinate painting.
No és que abominés de la pintura, sinó que volia assassinar un tipus de pintura acadèmica, repetitiva, que només pensaven en els diners, contentar els clients i els marxants.
Il était en colère avec lui-même, parce qu'il voulait toujours aller plus loin.
Between 1921 and 1928, Miro painted 3 portraits of Spanish dancers. In the last one, the paint disappeared. The pin replaces the dancer's head, and the feather, the weightlessness of the dance.
It is practically the total destruction of everything I have done before. Tree bark, textile fibers, collages, anti-paint. It was also a way of expressing myself through other materials.
Miro could no longer bear the authoritarianism of André Breton and decided to break away from surrealism.
Quand André Breton voulait, avec le surréaliste, créer des formes de dictat pour la peinture, il s'en est extrait tout de suite, il n'a pas voulu être prisonnier de ça. Miro était un homme libre, de tout temps.
Visto Roma siempre me fastidiaba. Y brillante todo sea una libertad absoluta y total, que nadie me impusiera una línea a seguir, pero se comprendió.
Miro often returned to his homeland to replenish his spirit. In 1929, when he was 36, he married Pilar Juncosa, a young woman from Palma de Mallorca. 1 year later, she gave him a daughter, Dolores. While the artist enjoyed a settled family life, the political context deteriorated. In 1933, the Nazi Party rose to power in Germany. Miro was worried.
I felt there would be an imminent disaster. Like before the rain, when your head is heavy, your bones ache, there's a stifling humidity. I could sense that a catastrophe was about to happen, but I didn't know what.
In 1936, Miro saw his country sink into a civil war, which would bring down the Spanish Republic.
Il l'a vu arriver, il l'a décrit, il l'a peint, il l'a ressenti profondément, avec une force extraordinaire, et il a su donner à sa peinture à ce moment-là quelque chose de neuf qui traduisait ces moments.
In 1937, Paris became a refuge for the Miro family. Miro had begun to make a name for himself with the public and the art dealers. The Universal Exhibition was an opportunity to express his anti-Francoism alongside other Catalan artists.
Du monde entier, les visiteurs ont afflué à Paris et dans toute la France.
In the Spanish Republic's pavilion, Picasso showed Guernica, and Miro presented El Segador, the Reaper, a huge canvas to honor the Catalonians who were fighting against fascism. It represented a peasant holding a scythe in his raised arms. After the exhibition, Miro gifted it to the Spanish Republican government, which had taken refuge in Valencia. But it went missing and was never found.
El Segador ha sido como algo que no existe, como un fantasma, mientras que la Guernica tenía una presencia física. Mientras que no vio fue una cosa que se fixó, comprende, se desapareció más luego.
In August 1939, Miro went to Normandy with his wife and child.
At Varennes-sur-Mer, a new phase in my work began, inspired by music and nature. War had just broken out. I felt a strong desire to escape. I put myself in a bubble on purpose. I let the night, the music, and the stars inspire my paintings.
There were no canvases, so Miro painted this series of small watercolors called constellations on ordinary pieces of paper. When the first German bombs dropped on Dieppe, the family immediately fled.
Pilar took Dolores by the hand. I had a portfolio under my arm with the constellations in it. We left Paris for Barcelona just 8 days before the Germans arrived.
Despite his anti-fascist convictions, Miro returned to Spain even though Franco had been in power for some months. This move was highly misunderstood by the Spanish intellectuals like Picasso, who had stayed in exile. Miro went to Palma de Mallorca to his wife's parents and took refuge in his work. In complete contrast to the vivid colors of the constellations, the artist painted the series Barcelona, black and white lithographs, inspired by Alfred Jarry's Ubu Roi, in which he denounced the violence his country had been subjected to.
La de Barcelona és un atac directe cap al franquisme i era realment una manera de demostrar que tot el seu món de monstres que vivia al subconscient l'havia tret a fora, l'havia plasmat al paper i aquesta bestialitat disruptiva de destrucció, violació, assassinat i genocidi de la seva Barcelona era un símbol antifranquista.
Ironically, it was during this period of solitude and retreat that Miro became a huge success in the United States.
L'utilisation des Américains, c'est les premiers vraiment qui l'ont reconnu. C'est 1941, lorsqu'il y a eu la première rétrospective de Miro au MoMA, à New York, au Jardin moderne, ça a été aussi cet emballement et cette reconnaissance de collectionneurs ou d'autres artistes qui ont reconnu en eux tout de suite l'artiste qui amenait un regard tellement neuf sur la peinture et sur son temps qui était indispensable de donner une place indéniable.
In 2017, the Acrovella Gallery finally reunited the Constellation series. 72 years after their first exhibition in New York, that had been organized by gallery owner Pierre Matisse.
Comment vous sentez-vous à New York? Je me sens très bien, mais pour quelque temps seulement. J'aime bien les chocs, la Méditerranée, avec ça. Oui, c'est intéressant. Mais un choc de temps en temps, oui, un choc très violent.
L'obra de Joan Miró té un moment de màxima atenció que és la sèrie de les línies construccions, que marquen un abans i un després. Per mi aquesta és la més important de totes a l'escala de la versió de Joan Miró. Aquí està la mort, aquí està la vida, aquí està la destrucció, aquí està l'esperança. Aquest quadre ens parla de dones envoltades al vol d'un ocell. Després d'estudiar Joan Miró tota la meva vida, ja he après a descodificar l'enigma darrere la poesia colombiana. I evidentment parla de la meva àvia, la Pilar, de la meva mare, la Maria Dolors, i la mort, del risc de la mort que van patir durant l'exili a França i després tornar cap a una Espanya un moment gravíssim després que es comencés la repressió franquista durant 35 anys. Oh my God, look at that. That's the smallest color movie he ever made. Calder and Miró from New Orleans brothers. Calder was 100% American, Miró was 100% Spanish, but their hearts, their souls, and their arts were like soulmates.
The two friends met in Paris in 1928. It was a decisive period for Calder. during which he established the essential direction of his work, especially the notion of sculpture in movement. His miniature circus is the most famous example. The circus, a passion shared by Miro.
When people look at Miro's work and they talk about joy, they talk about lightness, they call it childlike. People call it childlike because they don't understand what it is. Play, the word play. When an art historian or journalist would use the word play, I found it really insulting. It's like a swear word. Until I learned that play equals innovation. When you see a child at play, it's not a worthless task. It's the process of discovery towards perfection. And that's what Calder and Miro both did. It was a constant work towards perfection.
The two artists engaged in a rich and ongoing artistic dialogue and remained loyal and close to the end.
One of the most spooky things that ever happened between Calder and Miro and Calder is that, for me, metaphorically speaking, they lived together and they died together in the World Trade Center in 9/11, 2001. The grandpa had a mobile in tower number 1, Miro had a tapestry in tower number 2, and they vanished together in America. And that's something that really hit me so hard.
Miro's success in New York and Paris stimulated him. At past 50, he began to try out new means of expression.
The shine on ceramics draws me. I like fighting with the elements. Clay, fire. You have to learn to control the fire, the way Artigas does.
With his childhood friend, Josep Lawrence Artigas, Miro not only discovered ancient techniques, but also the pleasure of working with others. The days were exhausting. But Miro was helped by Artigas' son, the ceramist Joan Gardi, who still uses the same wood oven at Gallifa, near to Barcelona today.
Jo realment, inclús ella m'ho respectava perquè ja sabia fer coses que no sabia fer, d'habilitat mecànica de la ceràmica. I em Jonet, ajuda'm, això. Llavors, ja estava orgullosíssim d'ajudar al Miro, que per mi era el Miro, esclar. Era metòdic, organitzat, el taller tenia els pincells ben posats, tot net, però a l'hora de treballar llavors era lliure. Havia dibuixat en el carnet el que volia fer, després feia una altra cosa completament diferent. Tirava una gallada de color de negre, no li agradava a ell ni a ell mateix.
Miguel li va ensenyar a Miro a adorar les 3 bases capitals de la ceràmica, que eren la flama, la cendra i el fum, perquè això no ho aconsegueixes a un forn de gasoil ni res. Per això les ceràmiques de Miro tenen aquesta pàtina primitiva que la van potència.
Miro est toujours lié à la matière. Miro est toujours lié finalement à la terre, au sol, à quelque chose qu'il a connu, qu'il a touché, qu'il a su magnifier, modifier, métamorphoser.
Their small stature didn't stop these two geniuses from making huge murals, like this one where they were born in Barcelona.
El de l'aeroport és dels anys 70. Va ser una feinada, mira, aquí hi ha el número de plaques, 6.720. Després n'hem fet de més grans, n'hem fet 25 o 30.
Miro painted murals all over the world, like here in Osaka. His visit to Japan was a revelation.
C'est fascinant pour moi, parce que j'apprends un côté très très plus entièrement de tout ce qui est oriental. C'est pour ça que j'aime tant le Japon.
Miro a été fasciné par le Japon. Le Japon à l'époque, c'est pas le Japon d'aujourd'hui. Donc c'était un Japon hyper traditionnaliste, c'était un Japon tellement zen
que ça a fasciné Miro. Et Miro a d'ailleurs été chez des calligraphes japonais et il m'en a parlé en me disant « J'ai réappris à me servir d'un pinceau ».
Des de jove ja tenia una atracció cap a l'escriptura japonesa, sense saber que naturalment el grafisme ja és un dibuix.
Creo que las manchas o el trozo de las pinturas de Miro que aparecen, sobre todo posteriores a la Segunda Guerra Mundial, tienen mucho que ver con la filosofía zen. Intenta vaciar el yo, meditándose, o sea, sumergirse en el interior, cobra la fuerza del inconsciente, expresa todo el universo, aunque sea en una mancha.
Caractère chinois, c'est pour vous? J'ai mis ça parce que vous voyez, là où je travaille, j'ai créé une atmosphère. Et les caractères chinois, ça m'intéresse énormément. J'ignore la signification. C'est pour la forme. Ce sont des microbes un peu. Eh oui, c'est pour des microbes de poissons, des plantes, je sais pas quoi.
Donc, si vous voulez faire des opérations intracellulaires, c'est difficile, ça c'est grossi environ 5000 fois. Ces petits animaux-là, ils explorent la cellule pour nous. Alors, ce petit animal se promène donc dans le plasma, et quand il rencontre un globule rouge, vous voyez avec quelle facilité il entre.
Il devient son aise.
Celui-ci, spontanément, il fait quelque chose de très intéressant. Vous allez voir, dans la membrane à l'intérieur, et justement, cette membrane, nous devons savoir quelle est sa rigidité, sa souplesse, eh bien, nous pouvons ainsi faire un certain nombre de mesures.
Le fait que ce soit des globules rouges, c'est une chose secondaire. La première impression, le premier choc, c'est quelque chose de, enfin, plus que de beauté, de fascination. Ça, c'est tout près de la musique, de la plastique, de la chorégraphie, de la poésie, de tout ce qui m'intéresse.
Miro wanted to create a maximum of emotion with a minimum of means. He often painted large format canvases to emphasize the feeling of bareness.
I took a long time not to paint them, but to meditate on them. It took a huge effort and an enormous interior tension to obtain the bareness I wanted.
Miro est un peintre, c'est-à-dire quand il met un bleu et un rouge, ils sont dans leur valeur. Ils ne sont pas au hasard. Et c'est ça l'essentiel. Miro, c'est un jardinier qui cultive ses fleurs et qui sont ses tableaux. Mais essentiellement, c'est un très, très, très grand peintre.
Amy Mag, artist and patron, was the man who financed all of Miro's creative ventures right up until the end of his life.
La relation avec Miro a commencé avec l'exposition sur la liste en 1947. Dès ce moment-là, Miro est devenu plus qu'un artiste de la galerie. Miro fait partie de la famille.
C'est à la galerie Mac un défilé de têtes, d'amitié et de cheveux blancs. Monsieur Castro, conservateur du Musée national d'art moderne. La fille de Joan Miro qui rejoint sa mère. Weber qui revient dire qu'il y a un miroir dans le nom de Miro.
El Mac era un tio bastant, diguem, primari. Però, paraules del Miro, el Mac té molts defectes, però té uns collons com un toro. O sigui, la virtut del Mac era que era un enxampalante, que no tenia por de res, tenia diners, i tot això és el que feia funcionar la màquina.
It is here on the island of Mallorca, bathed in the intense light of the Mediterranean, that in 1956 Miro set down his bags. His friend and architect Joseph Louis Sert built him his dream studio. Today, Joan Pruniet lives with his family in his grandfather's house, which is right next to the studio. Pruniet remembers his grandfather ever absorbed by his work.
My daily schedule is very strict. I get up every day at 6 in the morning. At 7, I begin work until midday. Then I do 30 minutes of physical exercises. I have lunch at 2 o'clock on the dot, always a light meal, and then I smoke exactly 3 cigarettes. At 3, I stop work again, until 8.
Mira sometimes disappeared for hours at a time to meditate in a room which he called the Room of Absent People.
Aquesta habitació per mi era com una capella, i aquí podien tenir un moment de pau, de silenci, una calma, i s'asseia en aquesta cadira i fer una introspecció per tornar a comunicar-se amb ells i trobar respostes als seus dilemes.
On the wall were portraits of his parents and of his great friend and mentor, Pablo Picasso. Picasso, Miro, two eternally close friends. Two artists inhabited by the same creative energy, that was sometimes destructive, but who had a common obsession, to light a spark from whatever they laid their hands on.
On vient de la campagne, il s'engage jamais l'idée de faire un tableau au portrait. C'est l'astuce qui m'intéresse. Les contacts très directs avec la terre. Alors je ramasse un peu de boue, ça devient des statuettes, c'est un caillou.